Good morning and welcome to this opening session of the conference titled Propositions. I have three very interesting presentations to follow, so I'm going to make this very brief. The year 2012 marked an important landmark in the history of photography. After a series of decisions to phase out the manufacture of film, paper, and cameras, Kodak, the company which for over a century had become synonymous with photography, filed for bankruptcy. Despite this symbolic death, when it seemed that the moment of the photograph was over, we have re-witnessed a rebirth of photography in several avatars. Since then, of course, Kodak too has reinvented itself. But this event is symptomatic of a different moment. The arrival of the digital has shaken up and displaced a core belief in photography's relationship to the real. W.J.T. Mitchell even suggests that digitization and the virtual heralds what could be called a post-photographic era, and I'm sure that this term will come up many times. Rahab referred to it as well. Should we see this turn with anxiety, or could this be the beginning of a more productive way of looking at photography today? This is the core assertion and question with where our panel this morning begins its discussion. Now, I want to make a few quick points which are not necessarily in any chronological order, but they are hopefully areas that our panelists and perhaps the brief discussion after will prize open. The first, that photography does not exist on its own today, but is marked by impurity, intermediality, and convergence as a medium that attaches itself to other mediums. And I think both the practitioners on this panel and their practice will actually, draw attention to something, are actually examples of this. Perhaps one of, so photography today intersects with the moving image, with the painted image, with sculpture, with architecture, with performance. Perhaps one of the most significant shifts today is the fact that photography is no longer viewed as lesser or inferior to any other form of media. And the reason why I say this is that the school where I teach, which is Jamia, the university, forever, till very recently, photography was seen as an initial step towards a more evolved medium of film. This status is certainly challenged today by convergent technologies that make it possible to play both moving and still. Several theorists have drawn attention to how these technologies, the ability to pause the moving image, for instance, let's say with a DVD player or with a computer or with a projector, allows for reflection and contemplation, qualities that were always seen as unique to photography. And Roland Barthes, of course, made that famous statement about the pensiveness of photography. But it is equally possible today for photography in a digital age to be moved or to be animated. It is at this intersection of stillness and movement where some of the more significant debates of photography will now be located. Our current moment is marked by much greater interactivity, and so our relationship to images has changed. We are not just taking pictures, but also altering and remaking them, copying, exchanging, hiding, destroying, degrading, creating new forms of authorship. In today's world, capturing photographs is linked to cropping, sharing, commenting, linking, streaming, tweeting, and posting. Instagram and Tumblr or WhatsApp, Snapchat, and Facebook allow for a much larger participatory public for photography. They also extend the journey of a photograph as endless mutations challenge the limited life originally intended for it. As Ariella Azoulay has suggested, the photographed event is only an initial step in the much longer duration of what she calls the event of photography. This event that is constituted through the encounter between photographers, subjects, and spectators continues long after a photograph is taken. In fact, photographs increasingly generate events in which we all participate. Provocatively, she suggests that in our times, the event of photography can exist with the mere presence of a camera, even if a single image is not clicked. Of course, Azoulay's reference is to the use of photography in theaters of war and repression in Palestine or Syria, but she could well be speaking about Kashmir closer home, where what is not allowed to be documented is as significant as that which gets to be documented. Azoulay suggests that at times it is important to focus on what was photographed during moments of silence or censorship, and I think that some of those issues perhaps will come up with some of the other presentations later today. Having said that, we have never witnessed such an oversaturation of photographs as we have now, and we have never taken as many photographs of ourselves as we do now. The mobile phone is probably the most potent symbol of what is seen as this great democratic potential. It is undoubtedly an important time in the subcontinent, as photography has always been an elite pursuit in this part of the world. So one welcomes this profusion, the narcissism of the selfie too perhaps, because it has made it historically possible for people who have never been photographed to be photographed now. However, it is at this moment marked by instantaneity and overabundance that we also need more than ever to slow down, to edit, to curate, to archive, to be literate about visual storytelling, and to be attentive to the problems of only telling stories visually. Could we think of strategies to deal with the excess and abundance of visual noise? In an age of intermediality, could there be ways to destabilize the visual, allowing the photograph to be embedded in other immersive, sensory, and affective experiences? And I hope Sheba Chhachhi will refer to this in her presentation. I do want to make a brief reference to teaching and pedagogy and scholarship on photography, since this may not be raised directly by the presentations. For a long time, photography has existed as a technical discipline, and it has had an uncertain standing in academia. Perhaps one reason for this is the fluid ability of photography to locate itself within departments of visual studies, art history, visual communication, and even cinema. I recently attended a wonderful show by the graduating photo students of the Aurobindo School of Arts and Communication, and I think some of the students are here, but there are not too many such courses existing at present. I do know from Aileen, who teaches at Srishti, that the standalone diploma in photography that was started some years ago was discontinued, and that photography now intersects with other departments. One could look at this lack too as a strength. The limitation of not having a discipline that photography can call its own can be an advantage, as photography studies can borrow and draw from several disciplines. In the past few years, some of the best writing on photography has come from the field of not just literature, but also anthropology, sociology, psychoanalysis, cultural studies, and cinema. These disciplines have only enriched our understanding of photography. For instance, one of the most interesting interventions from anthropologists was the idea that photographs were not just images, but material objects that we hold, feel, touch, cry over, and occasionally feel desire for. The shift from film and chemicals to pixels and code offers other changes and other possibilities. One of the most major breaks with the past of photography is dematerialization, but that also enables a much greater sharing of images. It means that memory itself can be reconstituted, and that a connection with the past is not mediated by recall alone, but by imaginative projection and recreation. Photography was historically defined as the product of a singular moment or a single moment, but as data, the photograph need not take the shape of something static, as it is remediated constantly. It also means, as Aileen will point out in her presentation, that images can be created without any kind of encounter between photographer and subject. And what does then that do to the image? And that is hopefully what she will speak about. Finally, even as we witness the transformation or the transformative shifts posed by the digital, there is a need to interrogate the idea of the newness of new media. The arrival of the digital has not made the analog obsolete. In fact, the arrival of the digital has given a new lease of life to the analog. Digital culture has revived an interest in the past. Media archaeology pursues this trace of the past in the present, in forgotten media artifacts or obsolescence, in neglected or could have been histories. The current show, inspired by the overlooked legacy of Niepce, running right here, explores this very premise. As all three presentations will suggest, the algorithmic turn marks both rupture as well as continuity with the past. I would like to end with this idea with two found photographs that could perhaps be seen to illustrate some of these ideas. And I need to move to my first image. The first is a photograph that circulated in Deorala, Rajasthan, when Roop Kaur, a Rajput woman, supposedly committed sati, or self-immolation, joining her deceased husband on his funeral pyre in 1988. This early form of analog photoshopping shows us an event that no camera witnessed. Or perhaps it challenges and even mocks the evidential claims of a rationalist and realist form of press photography. My second example is an image of Miss Havisham on the London Tube. For those who may not know the background, Miss Havisham is the protagonist of The Great Expectations, a novel written by Charles Dickens in 1867. Jilted on her wedding day at 20 minutes to 9, Miss Havisham decided to be frozen in time, much like a photograph. She lived like a recluse in her decaying mansion, never removing her bridal outfit, leaving the wedding breakfast and cake uneaten on the table. She had all the clocks in her home stopped at 20 minutes to 9, the exact time when she had received the letter from her fiancé. Except that this digitally made photograph that I downloaded from Facebook and made my own has 4 instead of 1 woman performing Miss Havisham. Here they are, caught in the past, and yet propelled towards the future as they travel on this fast-moving London train. On this note, I'd like to hand over to our first panelist this morning.
Good morning. Thank you for coming to this seminar, and please excuse my English, which is far from perfect. It would have been easier for me in Hindi, but Rahab asked me to do it in English, so I will try to tell you through my own experience the evolution of my questioning, or sometimes perhaps should I say my doubts about photography and its medium. But sorry for that, I will have to go back to the last century. I was 19 and still drinking milk when the Berlin Wall fell and Eastern Europe became accessible for the first time to people from my generation. So 1 year later, in 1990, I was going to Czechoslovakia and Polonia with a camera and a lot of naive imagery of photography. I ended this trip in Berlin on the 3rd of October 1990, the day of Germany reunification. The city was overrun by photographers and media. By watching them work, asking people to enact joy and euphoria, and trying to create the images that the media had already ordered, I unconsciously realized that I was not, and probably will never be, a photojournalist. The only photo that I kept on this day is these pictures of a photographer taking a picture under the moon and between 2 advertising and false bottles of beer. What photography do we want to do? For who and for what? I always thought that photography was not meant to show, or worse, to demonstrate. Photography is at best a possibility of reality. It is, above all, the proposition of a subjective vision, an interpretation of reality. Photography interests me in its ability to question our times, our lives, our societies, our contemporary world. So 10 years after this first experiment, I decided to go to New York a few days after the 9/11 attacks. Consciously this time, I took the part of turning my back to the ruins of the World Trade Center and photographing only the looks and attitudes of the people who came to behold with their own eyes the place of the drama. The perception of that event told me much more about its impact and its consequences than the spectacular, unreal, and so cinematographic images that we all had seen on TV. I will let it finish this New York series. A few years later, in various countries, including Morocco, India, and the United States, where I lived successively, I kept this notion of reserve shots. I photographed people watching their television. In other words, people looking at the world through the prism of the TV screen. I often wonder what pictures will survive in the future. I mean, what photographs will have a real interest for generations to come. In this sense, photographing the normality or photographing things considered uninteresting seems to me as meaningful and valuable, if not more, than the great events, the historical moments, the exceptional situations, or the spectacular subjects. In 2009, I decided to come back to live a few years here in India. Carrying a step further my questioning about photography and its utility, I wondered whether vernacular or utilitarian photography would not be more rich in information in the end, than photojournalism or the so-called documentary photography. So I decided to explore the practices and the codes of these photographic fields: neighborhood studios, utilitarian and advertising photography, vernacular uses, Photoshop transformations, and so on. That's what I did with several projects, but through my projects, the others, I did it by reversing the regular way. My usual process consisted of going to another country punctually with my own practice and my own photographic style to photograph the people there, then to return home with these images. This time, I tried to adopt the codes of local practices, and then I only reported what I had been able to perceive from these people. Concretely, I used myself as material for my own pictures. I reproduced on myself the appearances of people encountered in my daily life by building, with my assistant and a hairdresser, the visible signs, clothes, haircuts, attributes that constitutes their identity. Some will call that self-portraits. I'd rather consider them as pictures of some others, as doing this project asked me much more observation and attention to the others than any of my previous work, in which the camera was doing the main part of the job. In some ways, I pushed to the extreme this idea, which is dear to me, that a photographer, whatever his approach, only reports what he has been able to perceive from the world or others. What do we see? What are we able to see? And as photographers, what are we able to convey and to provide? You know this guy, I guess. Yes. It's very funny because in France people think it's me, but here everyone knows who it is. I will just let this one finishing. So I don't explain every phase, but if you have any question, then I'll be more than happy to answer them. In another project, and still in India, I observed the practices of advertising photography, as well as the innovative and bold use of Photoshop. Drawing upon some of these practices, I asked the professional retouching studio Tasveer in Delhi to transform in the same way photographs that I had made with analog and medium format films. Looking at this series called Diversions and this diptych before-after, several people believed for a moment that I had followed the evolution of a construction site, or that I had come back a few months or years later to photograph the same places. What is real in photography? What is not? Do we all see the reality in front of us in the same way? In other words, how do we perceive the world? And to go further, how is it represented? More recently, in 2014, I went to Seoul in South Korea for a few weeks. And I also explored some photographic practices. One of them is a real issue to me, the practice of selfie. Until recently, the camera, as the human eye, was directed from oneself to others. Why did people suddenly reverse? Why have we returned it to ourselves? What is the need for this? Is it only because the technology has enabled it, thanks to mobile phone cameras? Is it the rise of a global and growing individualism, or a desperate existential gesture? By bending too much to look at this reflection, Narcissus runs the risk of falling into the water. When I was in New York in 2001, people took photos convulsively of the gap left by the collapse of the Twin Towers. They couldn't take anything specifically, but they had to keep a proof of it. There is no doubt that today they would photograph themselves in front of nothingness. These practices and what they tell about our world and our times seem meaningful to me, sometimes even more than the photographs themselves. I am often asked the question, analog or digital? My choice has little interest. The series, The Others, or Diversions mix both the two practices. They are only tools. But again, it is the way they will be used and what they allow that interests me. I believe that technology should not be confused with trends. I never tried to have an identifiable style. I adapt the photographic forms according to my purpose and intention. I always try to avoid current trends and the expectation of the public, or worse, the markets. It seems to me that it can be a real danger for photographers and photography. If I refer to the last 25 years and to the photographers of my entourage and my generation, we have globally moved from a photography focused on photojournalism to a photography focused on art. So from a photography related to a representation of reality to a photography related to representations aesthetic or aestheticized, not to say purely decorative, and often fictional. The logic of this evolution is clearly related to the economy sources of the photographic markets. The press became impoverished when the market of galleries and collectors grew from year to year. Some photographers I met, very active in the press some 15 years ago, hardly dare today to present themselves as a photographer, but loudly claim their status as an artist. I am personally against any kind of form or approach, but as I said previously, to follow the expectations of the demand of a public, a trend, or an economy appears to me a real risk for photographers. It seems to me that regardless the evolution of the medium, the photographers and the most interesting works are those which report on an attentive, personal, and singular observation of the world, or should I say the photographer's world. New technologies are democratic and they help create good images easily, a pleasant and aesthetically sound image. The beautiful image is no longer the privilege of the professional photographers. What a good news. It obliges every single photographer to position himself, to have an intention or a purpose. The attractive series with pretty pictures, but meaningless, might have a short life. The images and photographic works that will remain will only those that make sense. Well, I guess so. Thank you very much for your attention.
Good morning, friends. Thank you, Sabeena. Thank you, the organizers, for inviting me to speak. I start with a quote. A desiring mind seeks infinity and finds it today in a proliferation of signals. Electromagnetic waves beaming down from the skies, fiber optic cables emerging from the seas, copper wires woven across the continents. The earthly envelope of land, air, and ocean, the realm of organic life, or biosphere, is doubled by a second skin of electronically mediated thought. I'd like you to note thought. The noosphere. It's a vast pulsating machine, a coded universe grown complex beyond our grasp, yet connected at every pulse to the microscopic mesh of nerve cells in our flesh. This is from Brian Holmes writing about Guattari and the pathic cure at the heart of cybernetics. I'd like you for a moment to imagine yourself in one of India's dark villages, where there's no electricity and nobody owns a television. There are still many such. It is 2012, A large mobile stage has been set up in the village. Villagers have gathered. On the stage is a microphone and some flowers, a garland around the microphone. The rest of the stage is dark. Suddenly, magically, literally out of thin air, a figure appears. This is our Prime Minister, Mr. Narendra Modi, on his election campaign in Gujarat in 2012, within the form of a holographic projection. This form of holographic projection was used in the 2012 Gujarat State Assembly election and the 214 general election in India. The equipment to achieve this illusion, which is actually based on a 19th century optical method called the Pepper's Ghost, the equipment was achieved through a collaboration with a company, a London-based company called Museon, who give us a list of the equipment that was used. About 30,000 square meters of our Museon patented holographic projection foil, 200 Christie 20K and 14K projectors, 400 satellite dishes, 5,500 meters of trusses, 1,300 lights, 500 audio speakers, 200 sound mixers and power amps, and 14,000 meters of speakers and power cables. Modi was filmed in a studio and then broadcast live to a series of stages, which was set up temporarily. A BJP spokesman said in a telephone interview that the party was very pleased with the project. His high-end estimate for audience members at all the Modi via satellite rallies combined added up to at least 14 million people. That's fewer than the television audiences for Modi's in-person rallies, but the effect of Modi projected into towns across the nation came with its own potency. It was, he said, I quote, just like Hindu mythology, where God is omnipresent, so he is everywhere. I take you to another holographic projection, 2015, No Somos Delito, a platform of over 100 groups in Spain, protesting against the law of citizen security, also known as the gag law. On April 10, 2015, a holographic image of a protest appeared in front of Parliament. This was a radical group with very little funds of their own, a group of media professionals concerned about democracy in Spain designed this campaign, approached the groups, and, preferring to remain anonymous, set up what is perhaps the first ever hologram protest in history. I won't go into further details of statistics about this hologramic protest, but actually go to segue back into the 1980s and to an image which is in fact a photograph made by me in the 1980s. In fact, this is exactly 1980, of the women's movement in Delhi. Looking at the image of the Spanish holograph protest, what came to mind was something that I had actually done in a video which accompanies an installation based on this archive of images from the 1980s, also made in 2012-2013, in which lamenting the loss of public space for protest, where we are today corralled into one particular site, which is Jantar Mantar, and no longer can be outside Parliament or outside the Red Fort or these various seats of power, I had actually created a sequence in a video which accompanies, it's a photo-video installation, where ghosts, still images, turned into ghosts of previous demonstrations in these sites, move across India Gate. So looking at the image of the Spanish demonstration and segueing back to both memories of when you could protest in front of Parliament and today where this becomes a kind of virtual revisiting of certain public sites and spaces. So what does this analog image made in 1980, what kinds of meanings, what kind of potency does it retain when you think of it in the context of this huge explosion that everyone has spoken about, which I like to think of almost of the noosphere? How does one actually retain, relate to, and recover meanings embedded in these images? One of the things that I have done in my own practice, and I'm really skipping many, many experiments, is to work. I started as a documentary photographer and moved into working with the staged portrait, with collaborative portraiture, moving further and further away from the indexical, the evidential nature of photography, towards fiction, towards forms of performing the real. Declaring the profound subjectivity of the creation of the photographic image, arguing against the lie of objective truth, etc., all these debates. Also seeking to create forms of intersubjectivity, working with subjects in a manner that would generate a kind of performance of self. So the self that arises in this intersubjective situation is something that is produced by both the photographer and the woman being photographed. However, I'm not really today going to go in too much into these histories, but I want to take you to a 19th century device, just like Pepper's Ghost, which is the essential technology behind the holographic electoral campaign. I discovered on the streets of Old Delhi a kind of toy, what's called a motion lamp, and which I have further adapted and developed into something that is an animated light box, a moving image light box. This animated light box is both a device and a medium. Here it offers the possibility of a very new form of operating photographic montage, using both still and moving layers. The images realign photographic indexicality from historical trace to a performative presence. So I'm showing you examples of a series of works that I've done working with this device. The taps are a transparent layer moving across a translucent layer, quite slow in an endless loop. This is a set of light boxes called the Yamuna series, which looks at the condition of the water, hyper-urbanization, and what's happening specifically to women in the context of this death of the river in our city. What happens with the animated light box is very interesting. It basically is something that occupies an interregnum. It's a space between the moving image and the still image. It is neither still nor moving. In that sense, it is different from video or film, the moving image, and it is markedly different from the still image. It goes back to pre-cinematic experiments which mechanically moved a still image to create the illusion of movement. What happens here is a very special kind of temporality. I watch people as they encounter one of these animated light boxes, and what happens is an immediate slowing down. The same image as a photograph would have been something quickly looked at, and the viewer would have probably moved on. Here there is a slowing down. The gap between the still and the moving offers a place to open up a particular kind of attention. Further, here I am actually drawing upon a very wide range of image sources, from satellite images, from Google Maps, to photographic images, and layering them together to create mobile palimpsests. This is a work called Locust Time, which actually has these mutant figures moving across the landscape of a Google map of Delhi, into which are worked memories of the past, potential futures. It's a triptych, a set of 3 large animated light box. I'm not going to go further into the details of the conceptualization and the content of the image, but really focusing on what is happening in this kind of bringing together a kind of intermedial intervention. These are experiments that I got quite fascinated by, and for about, I would say, almost 10 years, have created a series of works which work with this. The layers increase, they go from 2 to 4, sometimes 5, directions change, scale changes, but essentially this is an extremely simple, low-cost device, drawing from the same 19th century source as the holographic projection. One of the troubling things about these debates between digital, analog, the death of photography, the future of photography, is what lies at the core of it is the vexed relationship between the photograph and the real. So if one actually, back in the 80s, late 80s, moved away from the idea of the photograph as document, indexical or evidential, and in fact thought of the photograph as fiction, as Olivier already spoke of, what one is now looking at is extraordinary fictional and imaginary possibilities. This set of images should give you some sense of the movement. Unfortunately, I mean, the animated light boxes really have to be seen physically for their full pleasure, but this gives you some sense of how you see the movement and the return of various layers. A lot of these works are actually engaged with questions of ecology and the ecosphere, so the noosphere and the biosphere are somewhere speaking to each other to kind of open up the possibility of contemplative space. One of the things that is significant in the new kind of image regime that we occupy is what has happened to the nature of attention. So I think it's not merely the production or the circulation of images, but the kind of attention that they elicit. This device has enabled me to actually elicit the possibility of a different kind of attention, to open up the possibility of contemplation and thereby thinking about the concerns expressed in the light boxes. So this is made maybe 2 years ago. It's many more layers, but it still is working with the same technology. I'm going to move from here to another experiment. I've taken the sort of instructions for the panel very seriously, so I'm actually picking up examples from my practice, so I'm not showing you a lot of photographic work. I'm actually showing you things which experiment with the photograph to try and introduce new ways of working, problematic, needing discussion, but also interesting in what they open up. So I'm going to take you now to a very different space, into a shopping mall. This is a red booth installed in the heart of the Select City Walk, where once you enter the booth, there is an image projected on the two-way screen. Once you enter the booth, you see yourself on the screen and you mix with the image that is projected. The sequence, which is quite short, just 6 minutes long, starts with a classic image of the mustard field. It's a classic romantic image of the pastoral, of the rural, and also of Bollywood cinema, into which the participant viewer suddenly finds herself or himself. Mustard flowers rise up, and you are then watch yourself enact a series of bodily transformations. All the images are anchored around foods facing genetic modification, and this was an attempt to actually bring this into public debate. So it is, in that sense, an activist intervention, but using playful performative means, trying to work off the kind of narcissism produced by selfie-taking, to turn it into something that perhaps would produce some kind of critical inquiry. So from mustard oil to rice to tomatoes to aubergines to the consequences of our earlier experience with biotechnology, which was cotton, BT cotton, which led to suicides, to, of course, the ultimate coding of the human itself as a product with a barcode, to cloned babies, and then back again to the mustard field. This works with gaming technology, tries to work with the narcissism embedded in the circulation of images. It also tries to make a performative invitation to the kind of people that frequent shopping malls, who are often people who may not be able to buy the products that are available in these expensive places, but enjoy the atmosphere of being a fantasy consumer, and what they may actually spend on is food, which is one of the reasons that this is food. So I'm going to take you I've got a reminder, so I'm going to take you very quickly into another way of working. To go back to where I began, if one thinks of this kind of complex, layered skin that we are all part of, this mesh that we are connected in, for me, one of the most interesting areas of intervention today is to actually work with the sensorium, to work with immersive experience. So Bhogirogi, the interactive VR gaming technology work in the mall, works with one level of immersion, and I'm going to take you very quickly into an on-site, site-specific installation called the Water Diviner, which was in the basement of the Delhi Public Library, which looked at the histories and memories of water in the city, bound very closely to the actual site. So as you enter, you are engulfed in a blue light. You are made strange, defamiliarized. You're surrounded with mountains of books bound into bundles. In the midst of these books are book-shaped animated light boxes which carry images and texts from historical forms of engaging with the river and with water, tracing the colonial, the Mughal, the pre-Mughal, etc., through mythology, as well as maps drawn from the 1830s. These are digital collages which bring together the real, the current contemporary situation of the river with mythological images. Maps drawn from 1831 which form a gutter taking you through the space right up to the end, where you see a video projection of an elephant. You move in a way from black water which pours out of the colonial lion's head, where the space begins, through this large immersive environment to an image of clear, pure water. The elephant fragments, implodes, dissolves, reforms in an endless cycle of the possibility of recuperating cultural memory, of the endless cycle of dissolution and reformation, transformation. Thank you. I'll end here.
So I'm going to very quickly just wrap up. I think that there were very interesting overlaps between all the three presentations. I mean, there were many themes which were interesting, which we could discuss. The idea of, I'm taking the more basic ones, the idea of performance, performativity, the question of the moving and the still image, which Sheba brought up very nicely at the end, the question of the immersive quality of photography, the sensorium of the image. But I thought that 2 or 3 areas that kind of overlapped through or 2 areas that really overlapped through all the 3 presentations, which were in some ways very different, but they also converged. One, the idea of location, that all 3 presentations were actually talking about a specific kind of location and being embedded in a particular cultural context. And Olivier's presentation very interestingly talked about the difficulties of actually entering a location and what then the outsider could do with practice. The other is that the idea of originality is clearly constantly in doubt, and all the 3 presentations actually talked about this inability to actually return to an idea of the original, because what is the original? And the third area that I think that everybody did refer to was this whole question of how new is the new media, the question of how the old and the new are constantly in dialogue. I think that was there in Aileen's presentation for sure, because you were talking about the fact that there was constantly this looking back at an earlier moment. Olivier, in your case too, and Sheba, you talked too about this whole idea of using an obsolete technology or something that perhaps still doesn't, is not the cutting edge, and then you reworking that in your practice.
My question is, it's fairly simple, and I think all of you could address it probably through your own works. And when we look at photography and its constant evolution into other mediums and even within itself, as its own provider and as its own, destroyer possibly, where can we find, or where could we talk about, how could we talk about rather, all these works or all these composites finding a place in a larger archive? How would you address that when you look at how photography is changing? Where or how could you possibly then locate it in a larger archive or a collection? How would it be viewed then? How would it be viewed? Would it be viewed as photographs or derivatives? And what kind of archive would it possibly find itself located in?
Basically, anything that can be measured, broken, and then combined again, according to information theory by Claude Shannon, can be digitized. So, taking into the specific medium of photography, different from painting, why is it that it is hard to point the immeasurable and give it a static experiential space that can stand the test of time? In that context, the issue of digitization will not even come. But why has that been consistently hard for photography? With an analog medium, I can understand it was there. But with the digitization, why has it been a challenge? Thank you.
Just to come to the question of the archive, I think that what's happening right now is a series of material transitions that the archive seeks to maintain the materiality. So as a photographer, you're often asked for silver gelatin prints if you have your negatives. I've just gone through a very complex exercise of trying to produce silver gelatin prints in Delhi, where most enlargers and darkrooms have kind of folded up, to digital prints on archival paper, which is extremely expensive but gives a 100-year guarantee, to actually digital images meant for circulation, consumption, and reception within digital means and methods. I think all 3 coexist right now, jostle with each other, and produce actually different kinds of relationships between whoever accesses the archive and the archive itself. Often the same material will take on these different forms. For me, what is of interest, in fact, when I very briefly mentioned the installation, was to actually revitalize the archive, to bring it into a new form. So if I had a set of black and white photographs taken in the 80s and 90s, I created out of that an installation annotated by a video, which was experiential. So I'm actually trying to bring in a layer of reception, a mode of address, a kind of relationship with people who wish to connect to the archive that moves away from mere storage.
Between analog and digital, I just noticed some stories, especially in the studios, neighborhood studios here in India. I started to look at their work maybe more than 10 years ago, and many times the people were telling me that I asked about their negatives and their prints, and they explained that they were fire, or the motion destroyed the negatives. And after 5 or 6 similar stories, I understood that they just throw away the negatives. They were a little sorry to tell me that. And so in a way, the digital threw away the archives of many studios. But what happened now is that the storage, the digital storage, take a lot of place on the hardware, and so it cost a lot of money. So after 2-3 years, the people throw away the pictures. So it's it's just 2 stories about that, the way the things could be kept or not. And well, the fact is, most of the time it's just there is no archives of the I don't know how to say, vernacular photography or this kind of things. So
I suppose in connection with the populations of images that we're dealing with and the saturation of images, the question arises, is it archivable? And is it necessary to archive? When these images aren't necessarily owned by anyone, they're orphaned images, they're constantly being reused, reiterated. What is to be achieved by archiving them, and how can these be archived when we're dealing with such a multitude of images?
I'd like to thank all of you for this wonderful session. And I must apologize for not having introduced you. So I must say now that Sheba Chhachhi is an installation artist, photographer turned artist. Olivier is, of course, a photographer. We saw his work. Aileen teaches at the Srishti School of Media. Is that Art, Design and Technology. I teach at Jamia at the Mass Communication Center. I felt very bad later thinking that we hadn't had any introductions. And of course, you will all get to meet them outside. Thank you very much.
Sabeena is also a filmmaker.
Thank you very much.